In the early 1900s, there was a neighborhood in America so wealthy, so successful, that people called it Black Wall Street. Black-owned banks, luxury shops, theaters, and elegant homes lined the streets. Doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs built businesses that rivaled those in the richest white communities. It was proof that black prosperity in America was not just possible, it was happening. But in 1921, something unimaginable happened. In less than 24 hours, the entire community was reduced to ashes. Homes burned, businesses vanished, hundreds of lives were lost. And for decades, America tried to pretend it never happened. This is the story of the richest black neighborhood America tried to forget. At the beginning of the 20th century, opportunity for black Americans was extremely limited. Across the country, segregation laws controlled where people could live, work, and even walk. Opportunities were scarce, and discrimination was everywhere. But in the city of Tulsa, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Just north of the railroad tracks was a neighborhood that would soon become one of the most prosperous black communities in the entire United States. That neighborhood was Greenwood District. Greenwood wasn't just another neighborhood. It was a symbol of independence, resilience, and ambition. Black entrepreneurs began opening businesses one after another: grocery stores, barbershops, restaurants, tailor shops, hotels, movie theaters, even banks. Money circulated within the community, strengthening it with every passing year. If someone needed a doctor, there were black doctors. If someone needed legal help, there were black lawyers. If someone wanted entertainment, there were black-owned theaters showing the latest films. Everything the community needed, it built for itself. Soon, Greenwood's main street, Greenwood Avenue, was bustling with activity day and night. Well-dressed businessmen walked past elegant storefronts while families shopped and children played along the sidewalks. Beautiful homes filled the surrounding streets. Some houses had grand porches, polished with interiors and expensive furniture, luxuries that many Americans at the time could only dream of. Word about Greenwood's success spread across the country. People began calling it Black Wall Street. For many black families seeking opportunity and dignity, Greenwood became a beacon of hope, a place where dreams could actually become reality. But not everyone was happy about Greenwood's success. As the neighborhood grew richer and more influential, resentment quietly began to grow just beyond its borders. And that resentment would soon explode in a way no one in Greenwood could have imagined. Because in the spring of 1921, a single moment inside an elevator would trigger one of the darkest chapters in American history. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, an entire community would be gone. By the spring of 1921, life in Greenwood District seemed almost unstoppable. Businesses were expanding. Families were moving into larger homes. New opportunities were appearing every year. The streets were alive with music, conversation, and the steady rhythm of success. But beneath that success, tensions in the city of Tulsa were quietly building. America in 1921 was a deeply divided country. Segregation laws separated black and white citizens in almost every part of daily life. Schools were separated. Restaurants were separated. Even elevators in many buildings followed strict racial rules. In Tulsa, the railroad tracks acted as a physical and symbolic boundary. On one side stood the thriving black community of Greenwood. On the other side lived the city's white population. For years, the two communities had lived side by side in an uneasy balance. But success can sometimes attract admiration and sometimes jealousy. And Greenwood's success was impossible to ignore. Black doctors drove nice cars. Black lawyers argued cases in courtrooms. Black business owners ran hotels and theaters that attracted customers every night. To the residents of Greenwood, it was a hard-earned victory. But to some outside the neighborhood, it was seen very differently. Many white citizens in Tulsa viewed Greenwood's wealth with suspicion and resentment. Some newspapers described the neighborhood with hostility. Rumors and exaggerated stories about the community circulated constantly. Still, most people believed the tension would remain just that, tension. No one imagined how quickly everything could spiral out of control. And then, On the morning of May 30th, 1921, a small and seemingly ordinary event took place inside a building in downtown Tulsa. A young black man named Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator. Rowland was only 19 years old. He worked nearby as a shoe shiner, polishing shoes for customers in a local shop. Like many black workers in downtown Tulsa, he had to follow strict segregation rules. The building he entered had separate elevators, and the one he used was operated by a white teenage girl named Sarah Page. What happened inside the elevator would soon become the spark that ignited disaster. No one knows exactly what occurred in those brief seconds. Some witnesses later suggested Rowland may have tripped and accidentally grabbed Page's arm to steady himself. Others believed he may have simply stumbled while entering the elevator. But suddenly, a scream echoed through the building. Moments later, Rowland ran out of the elevator and left the building quickly. The scream immediately drew attention. People rushed toward the elevator to see what had happened. Sarah Page appeared shaken, and rumors began spreading almost instantly. Someone contacted the police. Before long, officers arrived and began asking questions. At first, the situation might have remained small, just another misunderstanding in a busy city. But rumors have a way of growing quickly, especially in an environment already filled with tension. Within hours, word spread through Tulsa that a black man had assaulted a white girl in an elevator. The story changed slightly with every retelling. Some people claimed Rowland had attacked her. Others said he had attempted something far worse. None of these claims were confirmed. But in 1921, the truth often mattered less than the rumor. Later that day, the local newspaper printed a dramatic headline about the incident involving Dick Rowland. The article fueled outrage across the city. Soon, angry conversations filled bars, shops, and street corners. People spoke about the event with growing anger and suspicion. And as the evening approached, something far more dangerous began to happen. Crowds started gathering outside the courthouse where Dick Rowland had been taken into custody. At first, it was only a few people, then dozens, then hundreds. Many in the crowd demanded immediate punishment. Some openly talked about lynching. In that era, lynching was a brutal and terrifying reality across parts of the United States. Angry mobs sometimes took justice into their own hands, attacking prisoners before they could even stand trial. News of the growing crowd quickly reached Greenwood. Residents of Greenwood District understood exactly what this could mean. They had seen similar situations happen in other towns across the country, and they feared that Dick Rowland might not survive the night. So a group of armed black men made a decision. They would go to the courthouse, not to start trouble, but to make sure Rowland was protected. They believed that if the mob knew someone was watching, it might prevent the worst from happening. Late that evening, about 24 black veterans, many of whom had recently returned from fighting in World War I, quietly made their way toward the courthouse. They were disciplined, calm, and determined. These were men who had fought for their country overseas. Now, they were trying to protect one of their own at home. When they arrived near the courthouse, the white crowd had already grown large and restless. Tension filled the air. Some members of the crowd noticed the armed black men standing nearby. Whispers moved through the crowd quickly. Then the situation began to heat up. Someone approached one of the black men and demanded that he hand over his weapon. The man refused. Voices rose. Arguments broke out. The crowd pushed closer. And then, suddenly a single gunshot rang out. No one knows exactly who fired the first shot, but that moment changed everything. Within seconds, chaos erupted. People began firing weapons. Crowds scattered in every direction. Some ran for cover. Others ran for their lives. And as the gunfire echoed through the streets of Tulsa, something terrifying began to unfold. The violence did not stay contained near the courthouse. Instead, it began spreading rapidly toward Greenwood. Angry groups started forming across the city. And before the night was over, those groups would march directly toward Greenwood District. What had started as a single misunderstanding inside an elevator had now turned into a city-wide crisis. But the worst part of the story had not even begun yet, because as the night deepened and the tension escalated, thousands of armed men would soon move toward Greenwood. And by morning, the single gunshot outside the courthouse changed everything. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd standing outside the courthouse in Tulsa seemed frozen in place, as if no one could quite believe what had just happened. Then chaos exploded. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. People screamed and scattered across the streets. Some ran for cover behind cars and buildings, while others fired wildly into the crowd. The tension that had been building all day suddenly erupted into violence. Within minutes, the confrontation outside the courthouse turned into a running battle. The small group of black men who had come to protect Dick Rowland quickly realized they were vastly outnumbered. They began retreating toward the north side of the city, back toward their homes in Greenwood District. As they moved through the streets, white crowds began to grow larger and more aggressive. Word spread rapidly through Tulsa that armed black men had come downtown and fired on a white crowd. The story spread quickly, growing more exaggerated with every telling. Soon, groups of angry white citizens began gathering throughout the city. Some were furious, others were frightened, but many were armed. Throughout the night, men began entering hardware stores, pawn shops, and gun stores. Weapons and ammunition were purchased or taken. Some accounts later suggested that certain authorities even helped distribute guns to members of the white crowd. What had started as a tense confrontation was quickly becoming something much larger and much more dangerous. Meanwhile, back in Greenwood, residents began hearing the news. At first, the reports were confusing. Some people said there had been a shooting downtown. Others said a mob was forming. Still others warned that the situation could turn into a lynching. Families gathered in their homes, listening to rumors that spread through the neighborhood. Many residents remembered similar events happening in other towns across America, where mobs had attacked black communities after accusations or rumors. They feared the same thing might now happen here. So throughout Greenwood District, people began preparing for the worst. Men retrieved firearms from their homes. Some took positions along the southern edge of the neighborhood, near the railroad tracks that separated Greenwood from the rest of Tulsa. They hoped their presence might discourage anyone from entering the community with violent intentions. For years, Greenwood had been a place of opportunity and prosperity. Now its residents were preparing to defend it. As midnight approached, the atmosphere across Tulsa became more volatile. Groups of white men began organizing into larger mobs. Some climbed into cars and trucks, driving toward the northern part of the city. Their destination was clear: Greenwood. Rumors had transformed the events outside the courthouse into something far more alarming. Many people now believed that a violent uprising had begun, and they were determined to respond with force. As these groups moved through Tulsa, the situation escalated even further. Some began breaking into local businesses to obtain more weapons. Others stopped black citizens they encountered on the streets, threatening or assaulting them. The city was slipping into chaos. By the early hours of the morning, thousands of armed men were moving toward the boundary of Greenwood District. From their positions near the railroad tracks, Greenwood residents could see the growing crowd approaching. The glow of car headlights and street lamps illuminated groups of men carrying rifles, shotguns, and pistols. The tension was unbearable. No one knew exactly what would happen next. Some residents hoped the crowd might eventually disperse. Others feared something far worse. Then, shortly after midnight, the first major clash began. Gunfire erupted along the edge of Greenwood. Shots rang out across the darkness as the two sides exchanged fire. The sounds of rifles echoed through the streets, waking families throughout the neighborhood. Children cried as parents hurried them into basements and back rooms. Outside, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The mob continued growing larger and more aggressive. Some individuals began setting small fires in buildings near the edge of Greenwood. Others attempted to push deeper into the neighborhood. But Greenwood's defenders fought back. The men who had taken positions along the border were determined to protect their homes, their families, and the community they had spent years building. For a time, they managed to slow the advance. But the numbers were overwhelming. As the night stretched on, the mob continued expanding. More armed men arrived from surrounding areas. Cars filled the streets, bringing reinforcements. The balance of power was shifting quickly. Then, something even more terrifying began to happen. Groups of men started systematically entering parts of Greenwood, breaking into homes and businesses. Some buildings were looted, others were set on fire. Smoke began rising into the night sky. Residents watched in horror as flames started spreading from building to building. And still, the mob continued growing. By the early hours of the morning, the attack had become far more organized. Large groups moved through the streets of Greenwood, forcing residents from their homes at gunpoint. Some people were ordered to leave immediately. Others were detained and marched toward holding areas in the city. Families were separated in the chaos. The neighborhood that had once been filled with music, laughter, and success was now filled with gunfire, smoke, and fear. But the worst was still yet to come, because as dawn approached over Tulsa, the violence would escalate to a level few people could have imagined, and before the sun finished rising, the thriving community of Greenwood District would begin to disappear in flames. As the first light of dawn slowly rose over Tulsa, the residents of Greenwood District realized that the violence from the night before was not ending. It was only getting worse. Throughout the early morning hours, the sound of gunfire had echoed across the neighborhood, but as daylight began to reveal the damage, something far more terrifying was unfolding. Large groups of armed white men were now moving deeper into Greenwood, no longer acting as scattered crowds, but as organized groups advancing street by street. Some witnesses later described trucks full of armed men driving directly into the neighborhood, while others reported that the attackers were being joined by more and more people from surrounding areas. Within hours, thousands of armed men had gathered, and Greenwood was completely surrounded. Residents who had spent the night hiding in their homes now watched in horror as mobs began breaking into buildings, smashing windows, looting businesses, and setting fire to anything they could find. The thriving streets that had once symbolized prosperity were suddenly being consumed by violence and destruction. Businesses that had taken decades to build were destroyed in minutes. Elegant storefronts on Greenwood Avenue were broken open, their contents stolen before flames were deliberately set inside. Thick black smoke rose into the sky as fire spread from building to building, turning the heart of the community into an inferno. Families ran to the streets trying to escape the flames while gunshots continued to ring out around them. Some residents attempted to defend their homes, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer size of the attacking mob. Others were forced out at gunpoint and ordered to leave the neighborhood immediately, abandoning everything they owned. Panic spread to the community as people fled in every direction, desperately trying to find safety. Mothers grabbed their children and ran. Elderly residents struggled to escape burning homes. Entire families became separated in the chaos as the fire spread faster and faster through the district. Soon, blocks of homes were burning at the same time, turning the once prosperous neighborhood into a landscape of smoke, fire, and fear. But the destruction of Greenwood District did not stop at looting and arson. As the attack intensified, armed groups began forcing residents out of the neighborhood and marching them toward attention areas across the city. Many black citizens were rounded up and taken to large open spaces, including fairgrounds and convention halls, where they were held under guard. Some were forced to raise their hands as they walked through the streets, while others were searched and detained simply for trying to escape the violence. The thriving community that had once stood proudly north of the railroad tracks was now being emptied of its people. Meanwhile, the fires continued spreading uncontrollably. Witnesses later described seeing entire blocks burning at once as flames leaped from building to building. Hotels, restaurants, theaters, and stores that had once formed the economic heart of Greenwood were reduced to rubble. Homes that had been filled with generations of memories collapsed into ashes. The destruction was so widespread that some residents later said it felt like a war zone rather than an American city. Perhaps the most shocking accounts came from witnesses who claimed that airplanes were seen flying above the neighborhood during the attack. According to several reports, small aircraft circled over Greenwood while fires burned below. Some witnesses even claimed that objects were dropped from planes, possibly to start additional fires or create more panic among residents trying to escape. Although historians still debate exactly what role these planes played, their presence added another terrifying layer to an already devastating attack. By mid-morning, the once thriving district of Greenwood District had been almost completely destroyed. More than 30 blocks of homes and businesses had been burned to the ground. The streets that had once been filled with prosperous businesses and elegant homes were now covered in ashes, smoke, and debris. Thousands of people who had once lived comfortably in the neighborhood were suddenly homeless, standing among the ruins of everything they had built. The wealth, opportunity, and independence that Greenwood had represented for so many families had been wiped away in less than 24 hours. And yet, as devastating as the destruction was, what followed in the days and years after the tragedy would be almost as shocking. Because after the fires finally stopped burning and the smoke cleared from the sky above Tulsa, something unexpected happened. Instead of openly confronting what had taken place, many people in positions of power chose a different path. They chose silence. Records disappeared. Stories were buried. And for decades, one of the most violent attacks on a black community in American history would be pushed into the shadows, as if the world had simply decided to forget that Greenwood District had ever existed at all. When the fires finally stopped burning and the smoke began to clear above Tulsa, the destruction of Greenwood District was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire blocks that had once been filled with thriving businesses and beautiful homes were now nothing more than piles of ashes and twisted metal. The elegant storefronts, the theaters filled with music and laughter, the restaurants that had served families every night, and the homes where generations had lived and dreamed were simply gone. More than 35 city blocks had been destroyed. Thousands of black residents suddenly had no homes, no businesses, and no possessions left. Families who built their lives in Greenwood stood in shock, staring at the ruins of everything they had worked so hard to create. Many survivors wandered through the burned streets, hoping to find something: a photograph, a piece of furniture, anything that survived the flames. But there was almost nothing left. But as devastating as the destruction itself had been, what happened in the aftermath would leave a different kind of scar on the survivors and their descendants. In the days that followed the attack, many of the black residents who had been forced out of their homes were held in detention centers around the city. Large numbers of people were taken to holding areas, such as fairgrounds and convention halls, where they were kept under armed guard. Some were only released if a white employer or citizen agreed to vouch for them. The people who had once owned thriving businesses and comfortable homes were now being treated like prisoners in their own city. At the same time, the official response from city leaders began to shape the narrative of what had happened. Instead of describing the destruction as an organized attack against a black community, many reports began framing the event as a riot, suggesting that both sides were equally responsible for the violence. This single word would shape how the tragedy was remembered for generations. By calling it a riot, the story shifted away from the systematic destruction of Greenwood District and instead implied that the community itself had somehow contributed to its own downfall. Insurance companies quickly used this description to their advantage. Many of the policies held by Greenwood residents contained clauses that refused to pay for damages caused by riots. As a result, countless families who had lost their homes and businesses were denied the financial support they desperately needed to rebuild their lives. The wealth that had once flowed through Greenwood disappeared almost overnight. For many survivors, rebuilding seemed almost impossible. But perhaps the most shocking part of the aftermath was how quickly the story itself began to disappear from public conversation. Newspapers that had once printed sensational headlines about the violence stopped discussing the event entirely. Some early reports and records from the days surrounding the attack mysteriously vanished from archives. In schools across Tulsa, the tragedy was rarely mentioned in textbooks or history lessons. Children growing up in the city were often never told that one of the most prosperous black communities in America had once existed just a few miles away. Over time, the silence grew deeper. For decades, many people outside the black community had never even heard about the destruction of Greenwood District. Survivors carried their memories quietly, often sharing the story only within their families and close communities. Some feared speaking openly about what had happened. Others simply believed that no one wanted to listen. The once thriving district that had symbolized black prosperity became a shadow of its former self. Although some residents eventually returned and tried to rebuild parts of Greenwood, the scale of destruction had been too massive to fully recover. Businesses that had taken decades to establish could not easily be recreated. Wealth that had been built across generations had vanished in a single day. Yet even as the physical buildings disappeared and the official records grew silent, the memory of what had happened refused to completely fade. Stories continued to pass from grandparents to children, and from survivors to historians who slowly began uncovering the truth about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And decades later, as researchers and journalists began revisiting the events of 1921, a new generation started asking questions that had long been ignored. What really happened in Greenwood? Why had such a devastating event been left out of history books for so long? And could the story of Greenwood District ever truly be brought back into the light after nearly a century of silence? Those questions would eventually lead to a powerful rediscovery of the past, one that forced the nation to confront a chapter of history it had tried to forget. For many years after the destruction of Greenwood District, it seemed as though the story might truly disappear from history. The once vibrant streets of the neighborhood had been reduced to ashes, its businesses destroyed, its families scattered, and its wealth erased almost overnight. In the official records of Tulsa, the event was often reduced to a brief and misleading description, a riot that had spiraled out of control. But within the black community, the truth never completely faded. Survivors carried a memory of what had happened with them for the rest of their lives. Parents quietly told their children about the night the fires came. Grandparents described the businesses that once stood proudly along Greenwood Avenue. Families spoke about the theaters, the restaurants, the hotels, and the elegant homes that had once made their neighborhood one of the most prosperous black communities in the United States. These stories became a form of resistance against the silence that surrounded the tragedy. Even though official history tried to move on, the memories lived on through generations. Some survivors returned to the area after the attack and began the difficult process of rebuilding. With little financial help and almost no compensation for their losses, they worked slowly and carefully to bring life back to parts of the neighborhood. Small businesses reopened, homes were rebuilt, churches once again became gathering places for the community. But the scale of what had been lost could never truly be replaced. The wealth that had once circulated through Greenwood District had been built over decades. Generations of opportunity had been destroyed in a single day. For many families, the attack had erased the financial foundation that might have supported their children and grandchildren for years to come. As the decades passed, the tragedy remained largely absent from textbooks, documentaries, and national conversations. Many Americans had never even heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But history has a way of resurfacing, especially when people refuse to let the truth disappear. In the late 20th century, historians, journalists, and community leaders began digging deeper into the events of 1921. They interviewed surviving witnesses, searched through forgotten archives, and uncovered documents that had been overlooked for decades. Slowly, the story that had once been buried began returning to public attention. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma created an official commission to investigate what had happened in Tulsa nearly 75 years earlier. The goal was to gather historical evidence, document survivor testimonies, and finally establish a clear account of the destruction of Greenwood. The findings of this investigation confirmed what survivors had been saying for generations, that the attack had been one of the most devastating acts of racial violence in American history. The report described how mobs had burned businesses, destroyed homes, and displaced thousands of residents. It acknowledged the scale of the destruction and the long silence that had followed. As these findings became public, more people across the country began learning about the lost community of Greenwood District. Books, documentaries, and historical studies started exploring the tragedy in greater detail. Schools slowly began including the event in their lessons about American history. Memorials were created to honor the victims and survivors of the attack. And in recent years, the story has reached an even larger audience, reminding people that the past is never as distant as it might seem. Today, the legacy of Greenwood District is remembered not only for the tragedy that destroyed it, but also for the remarkable success that existed before the violence. The community represented a powerful example of Black entrepreneurship, resilience, and determination during a time when opportunities were often limited by discrimination and segregation. Its story shows both the heights that communities can achieve and the devastating consequences when hatred and injustice are allowed to take hold. The story of Greenwood also raises difficult questions that still echo today. What might have happened if the neighborhood had been allowed to continue growing? How many generations of prosperity were lost in those flames? And how different might history look if communities like Greenwood had been protected instead of destroyed? Although the physical buildings of Greenwood District were largely wiped away in 1921, the spirit of the community has never completely disappeared. Each time the story is told, the voices of those who live there grow a little louder. Each time the history is shared, the silence that once surrounded the tragedy becomes weaker. The attempt to erase the richest black neighborhood in America ultimately failed. Because even after a century, the truth about the Tulsa Race Massacre continues to be remembered, studied, and shared with the world. And the legacy of Greenwood District now stands as both a warning and a symbol, a warning about the dangers of hatred and injustice, and a symbol of the resilience of community whose story refused to be forgotten